Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit411, where we dive into resources and strategies that help nonprofits not just survive, but truly thrive. I'm Sarah Barton, your host and fundraising advocate. Each episode, we bring you inspiring conversations with experts in fundraising, sustainability, and best practices to equip you with the tools and confidence you need to make a real impact.
With the story.
Hi, and welcome to Nonprofit411 podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Barton, and I'm excited to have you here today. Whether you're here to learn, be inspired, or simply recharge, I'm glad you've joined us. Today, I'm excited to welcome our guest, Ricky Chilcott from Mission Met. He is one of the founders there. Welcome.
Hi, how you doing, Sarah?
Good. I'm so excited to have you here. We've been colleagues that have known each other for a couple of years now, so it'll be exciting to have a conversation with you. So before we jump into
Yeah, I was gonna say, thanks for having me. It's been enjoyable to meet you in person a few times at Nonprofits Lead, a local conference that's up in Marietta, Ohio. I don't live too far from there. And yeah, I really appreciated this last year with how much vulnerability you shared about your burnout journey, and that helped me. So thank you for highlighting some of those resources and sharing your story at that conference. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to have people who have supported me through that, and I'm glad that I can be able to help others as they also work through that process. So before we dive into our full conversation, I like to ask all of my guests my favorite question ever, which is, what is your favorite hobby?
Cool. Well, and I'm not going to answer it with one. I would say I came to playing soccer kind of later in life, and in my late 20s, I learned to play soccer, and that's been really great for me. I'm in the Athens County in Southeast Ohio, has a really vibrant local soccer community of 100 plus people are part of that.
Wow.
And yeah, I went from those first few games pretty much being offsides the entire time and not understanding that rule to, each season I score a couple goals, and I mostly play defense, so and wing. So that's it's odd for a defender or a winger to score a lot of goals. So that's one. I also really enjoy mountain biking, and I recently got an e-bike, and I've got a 4-year-old son, so we commute him to and from daycare with that. But I would say probably my most enjoyable hobby is kind of working with my hands as far as like building furniture. Just this week, I'm completing a bed build for my son, a lofted bed in his room. And I really, because of so much of the work that I do with technology and coaching, consulting people, it's hard to like show tangibly what, the end result of it. It's like you have all these meetings, right? Each day, and what was the actual result of that? You can't really point to something. You can maybe like explain a feeling or kind of talk about those interactions, but it's fleeting. It doesn't last very long. And so building things, even cutting the grass sometimes can be, or working on the house. That's probably my favorite hobby, because I can see the end result of it for longer than just, a feeling can last.
Oh, I like that. So I actually read a book this summer, and it was about the practice of Sabbath. And in it, he said, one of the things that he mentioned was that, if you work with your brain all day long, like a nice practice of Sabbath or rest is to do the opposite, like work with your body or work with your hands. So like what you're saying, like really resonates with that, the idea of that, like, it's really different from your day-to-day activity, or not day-to-day necessarily, but your work activity. You enjoy these tangible hands-on things.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates with me. Yeah, I read a book, Fight, Hustle, and Hurry, and he talked about the practice of Sabbath and some of these other, it was through a Christian lens, but kind of just everyday practices that people can kind of fight that hustle feeling, that especially as business owners, you and I know.
Yeah.
That tension.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that you said is, it's hard to measure the success of what we do, and I have found, as I've journaled, we're recording this in December. It's not going to go live until the new year. But as I've done this work, I've really enjoyed going back into my journals because you like the span of time from when integrated or did something to when you actually get to see results is a really long time. And so like being able to have the written word remind me like, oh yeah, I did that. Oh my gosh, I did that too. I did like a 6-month check-in, probably around June or July. So, 6 or 7 months, it all happens, fluidly. But and when I wrote down all of the things that I had done so far in the year, and I went back into my journals and I kind of gleaned, I have to go into my calendar to actually think about like what I actually did. It's so surprising how much has happened. And also equally surprising how little I feel that, right? How little
Yeah.
I feel all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard the saying, like, we way overestimate what we can do in a day and way underestimate what we can do in a year or a lifetime, right? And yeah, we tend to kind of compare ourselves and our output to like what we wanted to accomplish versus what we actually did accomplish. It was nice to pause. I've never really had a practice of journaling. I've tried before. I've bought lots of notebooks with that
Yeah.
intention, but have never done that. So
Yeah, I follow the Bujo method, which is the bullet journal method. And I don't think anybody would look at my journals and be like, "Oh yeah, that's actually a journal," but it just gets me through the day and I record a little bit. And it's all in one location. That's really for me been a really exciting thing. Like I always know where to reference because it's always in the book. Like this morning, I didn't have my journal on my desk and I had it right beside my journal and I wrote in this other workbook, but if I have to reference it, it's not going to be in my book. So I'll probably have to rewrite it into my book.
nice.
Well,
Yeah.
so we've already started chatting and covered some really good things here, actually, but I haven't given you a chance to introduce yourself. So would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them a little bit about what you do, where you are now, and how you've gotten here?
Yeah. So it's easier to answer what I do now, but yeah. So I'm Ricky Chilcott, co-founder of a company called MissionMed. Our mission is to make strategic planning simpler and more effective. We have built software to capture your strategic plan and then execute on it. And my business partner in this business, Eric Ryan, has done consulting work for nonprofits for a really long time. And so he leads our consulting efforts, and we have a few consultants. So we do consulting, the software, and we also developed a course on how to do strategic planning, primarily for small and mid-sized nonprofits. And if you would have told me a decade plus ago that I would be working with nonprofits and kind of in this sector, I would say, okay, that doesn't sound like what I would do. But my kind of background, my undergrad was in audio production, and I wanted to work in the music industry, record, musicians and artists and that sort of thing. But I realized kind of late in college that kind of all the things, all the like kind of market forces of audio equipment and tools of media production that made it possible for me to afford a home studio when I was kind of in late high school and in college were also the same reason why it was going to be really hard to make a career out of it, right? Because everybody could just buy a few pieces of equipment and call themselves a producer or an engineer. And I also looked at kind of the industry and saw a lot of divorce and kind of a lot of just kind of like personal life challenges. And I had met a girl in college, and I wanted to marry her and be married to her for forever. And so far that's happened. We've been married for 15 years. Um,
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I had also had this software development. I taught myself some programming kind of in middle school. My uncle was a software developer. And so I kind of went into this kind of technology space at the university, at Ohio University, which is where Athens, what institution is based in Athens, and worked there for a number of years at the university. But I kind of had this entrepreneurial itch and spirit. And so for a couple of years after I left the university, I kind of did freelance web development. But one of my best clients at the time was this guy, Eric, who, is now my business partner in MissionMed. But he had this dream of helping more and more organizations, and I thought, hey, maybe we could partner and grow the software and kind of productize our consulting offerings and that sort of thing, and kind of help more and more organizations. And so that's what we've been doing for a few years. I won't lie, it's been a little bit of a bumpy journey. Every projection that I put together was going to be up and to the right, and that hasn't happened. But I've learned a lot of things, and it's been incredible to hear from clients who we've been able to help through our planning work, how they've been able to raise more dollars, how they've been able to kind of fix dysfunctional boards and, help grow their teams and that sort of thing because of our strategic planning work. And so I'm really grateful just to be on that journey with Eric and with all of our clients.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. I didn't know all of that about you. And I think when you look at like the home audio studio, it's so crazy because podcasting has taken off.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. Like everybody can buy, cheap equipment and they can create shows. And
yeah, actually my freshman year at OU, I tried to start a podcast with 3 other friends, my now wife, and then my roommate Lanny, and a good friend Brian. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to put a mic in the room, and we're just going to have a conversation, just talk about college stuff. And they were like, this is the weirdest thing. We're not doing this. Nobody's going to ever listen to this. What are you talking about? These podcast things? What? So yeah, that was in 2004. So 20 years ago, I was, starting to listen to podcasts then, and kind of, I'm happy it took off. I like to say that, I'm an early adopter, and I predicted that one. But yeah, sadly, I never actually got a podcast of my own off the ground. So.
Yeah, but it's really interesting because you have within you a visionary spirit. So when you talked about your story, you talked about looking at the industry, the music industry, and looking and having a vision of what you wanted for your family, and like really pursuing the things that were necessary to be able to make that happen. You had this vision of podcasting, even though that wasn't something that came to fruition. This is clearly like a thread that binds you, and your work with Mission Met, is really also about strategically visioning for the future and being intentional about the work that goes into making that vision come to life. So like, it seems like there's this theme.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't even really realize that about myself. So thank you for educating me about my own. Yeah, that is a through line. Yeah, I think, in some ways I'm a dreamer. I'm not sort of like a super fan of the EOS system. And I think it's mostly for a lack of education on it. I've never actually read the traction book. I've read some things here and there, but I know that there are people who are more dreamers, right? And then there are people who are implementers. And I feel like I'm a unique snowflake, and maybe everybody thinks that they're a unique snowflake, but I really do enjoy like imagining possibilities and kind of like, thinking creatively, thinking through the constraints of what are our skills and what are our resources. And maybe if we just like shift and just think just a slightly different way, can we maybe create something from that? But I'm not afraid to like roll up my sleeves and like, either write code or write process or kind of work through it. I think where I fall down, one of my biggest weaknesses is I don't like maintaining things. That's just so boring to me. Like when I worked at the university, I liked kind of like solving problems, but after a while, it's like, these are just mundane and these are not interesting problems. And I don't know if I can keep just doing this, mundane thing over and over, to me. But like, I think there's lots of people, I had lots of colleagues who just really love kind of just maintaining systems and doing those. And so the world is a better place because they exist too.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea of visioning, I actually, shortly after I left the university and started to work out on my own, I hired a personal coach, a friend, David Dennison, and I actually just texted him this week to see if he wanted to catch up. But he actually walked me through a curriculum called Strategic Futuring. And I think there's actually 2 or 3 different people out on the internet that use that. This is from a company called Genesis, Gensys, I think. And there was a book that was written about like future belongs to those who dare, I think is the name of it. If you Google something like that, you'll probably find it. But they kind of walk you through a process of kind of envisioning your future. Like what is a random day 15 years into the future, and like kind of transport yourself to that. And, what does it feel like to wake up, look around your room, put your feet on the ground, what does the carpet, like what does the floor feel like? Is it carpet? Is it hardwood? Is it, and just really describe those things. And that was a really impactful experience to do that. I wrote like a 7 or 8 page thing, and my coach David was like, wow, I've done about 10 of these, and this is the longest one I've ever gotten. But it's really helpful because if you can like just imagine, and the reality is you'll never experience that exact thing, right? But it really kind of then you can start to pick it apart and like, well, why did I write that about myself? Or why did I imagine that was the kind of future that I want to have, or the impact that I want to have, or, you know, why was my day structured in that way? And you can start to learn some things about yourself. And more interestingly, and as it comes to strategic planning, part of that exercise is actually walking back in 5 year increments. Like, what did you do 5 years prior to that moment in order to get yourself there? And then what did you do 5 years before that? And what did you do 5 years before that, which happens to be today, right? So what decisions and actions am I going to take to get me closer to that? So anyway, so I did that experience, but my business partner, Eric, if we can work with a client in the way that we would really prefer to, because sometimes there's RFPs and they have a very particular process that they want to lay out, and we'll support those, of course. But our version is to really kind of first start with the mission and the vision of the organization, right? Mm-hmm. Who do we want to serve? How do we want to change their lives? And what does the world look like when we're successful at that, right? If we can answer those 3 questions, we can come up with their mission and their vision. And then, through some of our assessments and through conversations and looking at past plans and that sort of thing, we can identify, and oftentimes if you ask executive directors, what are 2 or 3 or 4 areas that you really think you should focus on? They know the answer. They don't need to ask the team. They should ask the team, but they kind of know, because they're kind of pulling together all the myriad of conversations and assessments and kind of board conversations, all sorts of things to really kind of distill that down. But anyway, when you kind of get to those, what are those kind of key areas, what we call focus areas on the plan? You're going to focus on. Oftentimes it's going to be something related to programs. Oftentimes it's going to be something related to fundraising, maybe, governance or staff or kind of people related things. But then you write a 3-year vision for that. What do we want our programs to look like in 3 years? What do we want our fundraising to look and feel like, right? So not just how much money are we raising, or not how much, like how our programs are impacting people, but like, are they run, consistently? Are we not putting out fires, right? Is everything documented? Is, when new team members join the team, do they have clarity about how to really run this program instead of like making it up again, in the time they go there, right? So getting really clear on what do those look and feel like. And then you come up with some goals to say, what's 1, 2, 3 things that we can do to take us closer to that vision, right? And so when you start to break it down that way, there's really hard problems or things that you've never really been able to solve before, and maybe you're never going to reach that particular vision in 3 years, but you're going to learn something in that, and you're going to work towards it. And so really, kind of breaking down strategic planning just into like those kind of core concepts is really impactful for people, for an organization, for a person, for a department. So yeah.
Yeah. So kind of the working backwards, like from where you want to be in the future. Yeah. So that's really interesting that because I do think like that's a great description of how strategic planning can be so impactful and so meaningful when we're looking at measuring our success in meeting these. So one of the things like I have just often said to people is that, it's easier to look how far you've come versus how far you have to go. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at metrics for measuring our success, how do we do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm but still drive and rewards, like something that drives and rewards us as we go through the process.
Yeah. And that's a great question. We absolutely think that metrics and quantitative measures are really valuable to consider. But and I think this idea is becoming more popular, but I think everybody thinks that they need to be data driven, right? Everybody, imagines that. And in larger organizations, they absolutely are. But the reality for smaller organizations is they don't have enough bandwidth or the tools or the systems to measure all the things that they need to. And so they can't in some ways be data driven, right? And so we kind of, that doesn't mean you should just ignore data, right? And never track anything or never, right? And so it's really this kind of continuum. I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I've been thinking about a model. We talked about models before the call started, but there's sort of like, getting organizations from totally a lack of data maybe to data curious, right? Or they're just asking questions like, what could we possibly measure that is going to help us be clear on this over time, right? So maybe you can be data curious. Then you can maybe be data influenced, right? That like data, quantitative measures can influence your decision making, but still you're going to have to make decisions based on gut to some extent, based on your life experience and that sort of thing. And then, all the way to data driven. And I think even when you talk to most organizations, like very few decisions are truly made only based on data. And when they are, people don't really like those decisions, right? And so it needs to come with a lot of, smoothing over or what have you. So I think that's a start of the answer. I think just like goal setting, like our perspective, just like goal setting is you got to start somewhere, right? So I would rather have an organization tracking a few things that they have determined are not too onerous, but still are likely to help them answer questions over time, but just kind of build that habit and then kind of layer it on. But I think it is a really hard thing, especially in small organizations, because there are just so many variables that you could just imagine, we should be tracking this KPI. And in the end, it actually doesn't mean anything. And so I don't have a great answer and a very, contextual, but I think, start somewhere, refine it over time, maybe have a goal, once a year to kind of review, like, are these particular quantitative measures helping us understand if we're on the right path or not, and just have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that conversation is really, really important. Like, is this helping us understand? Because it's really been interesting to me as I've worked with a lot of organizations over the years. They don't always understand why they're collecting the data. And so like they maybe don't collect it well, or they collect it and they do nothing with it, kind of like what you said, but it being really meaningful. And I love it when I talk to an organization and they're like, well, I was talking to somebody yesterday and they said, well, we have been tracking this, but that didn't really tell me what I needed to know. Like if I track, they were tracking like two different types of clients that they had. One would be at the beginning of an illness and the other one would be after the first round of treatment for the illness. And so, but they weren't tracking that yet. And she said, if I track this and I find out which stage they're at, there's actually different opportunities, for people who are just newly diagnosed versus those who are survivors and who have completed. And I was like, yes, like that's a really meaningful way of looking at your data. So she wasn't just looking at what numbers are we collecting. She had a reason why she might want to segment it. And so, kind of, I love your data curious and data influenced all the way to data driven, because we're not always ready. We're not always ready for every model that we see out there, to be able to implement it. And when we are a solopreneur, or if we're a solo shop for a nonprofit, then we just, being a solopreneur, I can say like, there's just not the capacity. I can't do it all. I can't, I can't offer my programming and always do all of the back end stuff really, really well because there's only one of me and we all have capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in our software, we're starting to, we have some metrics tracking. And one thing that I was going to highlight is that ideally those measures are reported on to some extent regularly, with transparency with the staff if you have it and with your board. So something to keep in mind is, what are things that we can measure, but then also can kind of be, published and, not necessarily, I mean, ideally be held accountable to some extent around it, but also recognizing that there's all these external influences that are going to, affect how those things are. The other thing that we're starting to build in our software, or as a feature that we're working on the next 6 months, is kind of this idea of compound metrics, right? So just because you measure one thing, like that number might need to be added to multiplied against something else, right? In order to really, like in the financial world, there's all these different ratios that you can be looking at, your, um, your assets versus, your income, right? And so how are you utilizing, like what impact of the assets that you have? How is that driving revenue, right? So just an easy one to talk about. But there's all these different types of ratios that you can say. So like just tracking one thing might not be enough. You might need to be tracking multiple things and kind of doing some equation on there. And that starts to get more complicated unless you have the right tools, unless you have the right systems and processes to track it and measure it and then use it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But it is really helpful. And it's really helpful to be able to work with someone who understands some of the cross implications of the data, so that they might be able to recommend ways to utilize the data that you're already collecting in a new way and make it even more meaningful. When we look at return on investment is sometimes very difficult to measure when we're talking about impacting humans. But there are some other return on investments that are a little bit easier to manage and something that if we have the capacity to should look a little bit at, right? Like how much per person are we spending or investing, to make this change? Well, you probably have you have the information about how much you have spent, and how many clients you have. Like, so just even looking, and it's not a perfect calculation, but
Right.
if you divide your expenses by the number of people you're able to serve, you can get a rough estimate about the cost per person that's being served. And you can look at that. And that's a really helpful metric to be able to say, hey, if it costs this much per person that we're serving right now, if we want to serve X number of people more, we can guesstimate that
Right.
it will cost this much more, right?
Right. And maybe there's some economies of scale, right? So it might go down a little bit. But also if you're tracking that thing over time, and that probably is not that hard to track, right?
Yeah.
You're already tracking how many people you serve, and you're already tracking your revenue or expenses. Is that number going up and down, right?
Yeah.
And so like what changes did we make around that? And so some of that, what can be helpful is not only measuring those things, but also kind of going back to the journaling that you talked about on a personal level, making a journal of we made this decision at this time. So that way, 6 months from now, or a year from now, 2 years from now, when you see this dip or this spike, in this chart, why did that happen? I can't remember. But we can go back to our log of here were some kind of bigger decisions that were made in the organization at this time. And hence strategic planning software might be able to help with that, because then you have a log of all the things that were worked on and what you were trying. But still, that this idea of just being a little more intentional in kind of logging the quantitative outputs and then the decisions that are happening, at the board and the staff level, and see how it changes over time, right? To better understand your business, better understand how to serve your communities.
Yeah. And for the listeners, I have used Kazi. So I've used the software that Ricky's talking about. And I think one of the benefits of using something like Kazi is that you have captured, because I think this is the most important piece, you have captured how you were measuring things. And then you're capturing the data and using it in that way. And you can reference back to it, because for so many of our small to medium nonprofits, if we experience turnover, that can mean a large portion of our staff. If it's a smaller organization, it could be, if you're a staff of 3 and you turn over one person, that's 33% of your organizational memory gone like that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really so wonderful when we have captured some of these things, so that when the new person refers back to the number, and they ask the question, what does this mean? They have something to reference and they have something to build from, rather than having to really either kind of backfill all of that information, because they're going to have to get the information one way or the other, right? How did we do this and why are we doing it? And so I think that Kazi is a very affordable option for organizations as a tracking mechanism. And if it's not that particular software that they choose, having a software that helps explain the data that you're utilizing or having that recorded somewhere institutionally is really vital.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just in general, the habit of writing things down, here was our plan, here's what we were going to measure, here's what we did measure, here was the impact of that. It goes a long way when there's turnover, leadership and staff and boards. There's typically a 6-month to a year-long process of a board member even just kind of just understanding the basics of the organization and really how it operates and that sort of thing. So if you can speed that up, then they're going to more likely to provide their expertise or their guidance or decision making much faster, right? So if you can point them back to things, as appropriate, that can be really helpful, even on the governance side.
Yeah, that's true, right? The faster we get up to speed, the quicker we're at speed. So can you tell our listeners where they can find you and learn more about Mission Met and Kazi?
Yeah, absolutely. So our company website is missionmet.com. And if you can get to the Kazi site from there, but kazi.app, it's CAUSEY.app. And I'm not super active on LinkedIn right now, but I am kind of taking a little bit of a social media break in the last quarter of this year. But you can connect with me there, and I'd love to chat and see if I can help in any way, shape, or form.
Awesome. And then the last question that every expert gets to answer is, what is a tip or some type of advice that you'd like to give every nonprofit?
So in regards to, this is kind of the most impactful thing that when I, beyond the visioning thing that my business partner shared in our planning process, but it's about goal setting. And, a lot of people set goals like, I want to lose 10 pounds or I want to lose, 15 pounds. And they might even say, okay, I'm going to use SMART. I'm going to be specific, measurable, attainable, all those things. I probably got one wrong already. So they're like, okay, by this date, I'm going to have lost this amount of weight. And, so the problem with that is it doesn't tell you how you're going to do it, right? And it also doesn't, for something like weight loss, especially, sure, you probably want to fit into a pair of pants or look different slightly. But digging deeper, you really just want to be healthy, right? You want to be at a healthy weight for your body type and all those kinds of things. And so it's better to kind of develop what we call, or what other people call, process goals, right? So what is a process? What is a system that we're going to put in place so that we are healthy, so that we ultimately lose that weight, keep that weight off, right? And so a better goal might be, I'm going to, walk 10,000 steps 4 days a week, or I'm going to meet with, this friend and this friend, weekly to go for a jog or a bike ride or, to lift weights or what have you, right? So being really intentional about setting more processes and systems in place so that that end result comes to fruition. And you can make that even better by having somebody who's kind of a champion with you on that, right? So you have somebody else that you are connected to that also can be on that journey with you, right? Because we do so much better work. We're much happier when we're, kind of making changes with others, holding them accountable, them holding us accountable. And so if you can find, some friends to help you in that, weight loss or getting healthy goal, all the better. You're more likely to do it. And so, in our planning process, we often coach organizations to have co-champions for goals, that two people are working together to develop a process and then implement that process.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. We work better in community, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing with our listeners all about strategic planning and goal setting. This was a great conversation. To our listeners, I hope that you tune in next week and that we'll have more opportunity to learn more about nonprofit work and how to do more work better. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Nonprofit 411. I hope you found today's conversation as insightful and inspiring as I did. Remember, building a healthy nonprofit requires a holistic approach. There are many resources available to support your staff, and we're dedicated to helping your organization access what it needs to thrive. One key to creating a thriving organization is a diverse fundraising strategy. While grants are an important part of that strategy, they're just one piece of the overall puzzle. If you're looking to strengthen your grant writing skills as part of this bigger picture, I've got a resource to help you get started. Download my free grant writing guide, packed with practical tips and best practices to help you craft proposals that align with your overall fundraising goals. You'll find the link in the show notes. And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your fellow changemakers. Let's work together to build a vibrant nonprofit community. Until next time, keep pushing forward and making a difference. Feeling the pressure of meeting your nonprofit's fundraising goals? You're not alone. Many nonprofits struggle with limited resources, donor fatigue, and a lack of clear strategy. Nonprofit 411 offers personalized coaching to address these challenges head-on. Together, we'll tackle your biggest obstacles, boost your donor relationships, and build momentum toward your mission. Don't let obstacles slow you down. Start your coaching journey today at nonprofit411.org.